Hi, I'm Heidi Otway, your host for this Conversation on Cannabis virtual forum brought to you by the Medical Marijuana Education and Research Initiative at Florida A&M University. In this conversation, we're talking about marijuana reclassification and the potential impact on workplace drug testing. So let's talk and learn about this subject with our guest. Mark Maxim is a leader in the drug and alcohol testing industry. For nearly 30 years, he gained extensive expertise and experience in the field of drug and alcohol screening and compliance. Mark, welcome to the forum. Tell us more about yourself.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I am very honored to be able to join today and talk about today's topic. I got my start in drug and alcohol testing out of law enforcement, and 28 years ago, I began my journey in this field, learning every aspect that this industry has to provide from workplace testing, including the private sector as well, working with rehabilitation facilities, parent networks, in addition to the courts and legal system as well, besides the employment industry. So it's been an absolute joy to provide and give back what I've learned and what I continue to learn today, to be that individual that has some knowledge around drug testing and alcohol testing and how it relates to almost anyone in our wonderful country.
Yeah, well, Mark, thank you for being here. I'm so looking forward to this conversation. To everyone joining us on this live program, please share, post, and tag a friend on Facebook to have them join this conversation. If you're on YouTube, share the link so others can join us as well. During the forum, we want you to send us your questions in the comment box, and we'll do our best to have our guests answer them. We also want you to tell us what you think about this forum by completing the survey that will be posted in the comments on YouTube and Facebook after the live program. Your name will be entered into a drawing on July 11th, 2024 to win a $100 gift card provided by one of Mary's partners. Now, let's start this conversation on cannabis. So, Mark, I just want to plant the flag and find out from you, when and why do employers conduct drug testing of their employees?
Sure. So, drug testing is something that dates back to as far back as the 1980s, when President Ronald Reagan signed the executive order creating the Drug-Free Workplace Act of 1988. And that was really where drug testing kind of was born, so to speak. And employers choose to do this for a lot of various reasons. The most important reason is safety, the need and desire to provide a safe work environment for their valuable asset, and that is their employees. But in addition to that, they also wanted to have productive and high performance individuals that are drug free. They also do it for insurance benefits in some cases. They do it to avoid accidents and injuries and the workers' compensation claims that are seen from it. There are countless studies out there that show, workers' compensation costs increasing, and approximately $44,000 per medically consulted injuries are seen. And that's just one where you have everything $85,000 for motor vehicle crashes. So I think in a real bigger, broad perspective, employers really want to protect against those things. And so that's really what brought it about. But more importantly, those employers that work in the transportation sector are required to do it by federal regulation. And so they have a requirement to conduct testing on the various different types and when to test and what to do. So, and that was by executive order that came down, where it was actually mandated by the presidential order back at that time. Yes. So that's really a couple of different reasons why employers do what they do in the drug testing arena.
So what what prompted the need, the federal law regarding drug testing for workplaces?
Sure. So, back in the 1980s, we experienced as a country in our transportation sector two very prominently well remembered incidents of derailed subway and a derailed Amtrak train, where both of the operators were under the influence of marijuana. And so, out of those hugely accidents that involved fatalities, it's what led the actual government back at that time to create the executive order and get the ball rolling, which then, of course, came about the Omnibus Transportation Employment Act as well, known as OTETA. That came out in 1991, which is really where we got our start for the transportation industry as a whole, and the creation of the regulations and what's required of any employer that works in the transportation sector and what they're required to do in order to maintain compliance, but more importantly, to try and protect public safety.
Yeah. So it's my understanding that these types of jobs are called safety sensitive. What other industries, well, if you can explain that, but then also what other industries are also having to comply with drug testing because of the safety issues?
Sure. So, we have many different sectors that comply for various reasons. So, obviously, we have the Department of Health and Human Services, which is what kind of oversees the program, and the Department of Transportation then follows along with the actual regulatory part. So the DHHS handles and oversees with the National Certified Laboratory Program for certifying laboratories. And the Department of Transportation, of course, follows a lot of DHHS in some similarities, but most of the different modes, of course, have some slight variations in their actual protocols and regulatory compliance. But as far as a safety sensitive position is concerned, it is really a job that would impact public safety, such as pilots flying the airplanes, to air traffic controllers, school bus drivers, people working on pipelines and with hazardous materials, people in mass transit, such as the city buses in our cities or subways, and or government-funded programs for the Federal Transit Administration, as well as our trains. And then, of course, all of the semis we see up and down the highways transporting the freight to and from destinations. Those are all examples of safety sensitive positions within the Department of Transportation purview. Now, outside of that, you also have employers that will have individuals in safety sensitive functions that maybe fit the definition even more, in that if they're operating a forklift, if they're working on a manufacturing line where they could actually cause injury to themselves or others. So these are all examples of safety sensitive defined positions, which then lead to what the requirements come to play. And you have to worry about the state laws as well, in addition to the federal requirements for all of the federal employed individuals. But you also have to consider the state that you're in, and does that state have a requirement? Or do you have a government contract that requires you to have a drug testing program? So that's really various areas that you really look at. And some state laws have clearly defined what a safety sensitive position is. So it really becomes important for us to make sure that we do the research.
Yeah. So what are the most common ways that the drug tests there's drug testing for those positions? So what are the common types of drug testing? for those?
Sure. So, currently today, the most common is a urine drug screen. But in addition to that, there's also the ability to test for drugs in oral fluid, so saliva, as well as hair testing. There is also the ability to test for drugs with a sweat patch, fingernail testing. So there's many different methods in where you're able to detect drugs in an individual based on any of those testing type methodologies. But for the Department of Transportation today, the only one that is approved is urine. We are soon going to see oral fluid as soon as the device and the two laboratories get certified. Oral fluid will then become a part of that as an option for the Department of Transportation covered employers. Now, when we get into what we call the non-transportation, or we call it the non-DOT area, this is those employers that have forklift operators or manufacturing facilities, but you can also see it in retail and almost every industry across the country that an employer decides they want to have a program. So they may use any of the other methodologies that I mentioned because those methodologies, of course, have a laboratory that is certified and is able to test those samples for those employers and provide them with a result.
Yeah. So in these safety sensitive jobs, what is the cadence of the drug testing of those employees?
Sure. So it always starts off with a pre-employment drug test. So the negative pre-employment drug test is needed before the actual individual begins to perform that safety sensitive function. From there, then depending on which mode of transportation you're working in, the individual will go into a random testing pool. And based on each of the modes, there is a requirement for how often the testing must be conducted. So randomly, I use the example with the trucking industry. So this industry tests those drivers, 50% of them per year for drugs, and then 10% for alcohol.
Wow.
And each of the modes may be a little different. But for the purposes with, the trucks and the school buses, those folks, those drivers go into a pool and 50% of them are tested annually. So that cadence really comes where we do it every quarter. So every 3 months, there's a selection that occurs, and that employer is provided with the list of individuals that need to be tested, and they will then comply. Now, in addition to that, the employer also has responsibility with regards to post-accident testing. So whenever there happens to be an accident defined by the regulation for that mode, they will then be required to do drug and alcohol testing. There's also reasonable suspicion. So employers have their supervisors trained on the signs and symptoms and being able to determine when we're going to request a test. And then lastly, for individuals that do test positive, we then have the final two categories, which are return to duty. This is done after an individual goes through counseling. And then we have follow-up testing, which is that checks and balance, if you will, on the individual for a period of time to ensure that they are complying with the actual recommendations of the substance abuse professional. So that's really the cadence on how it really works within the Department of Transportation. And it's almost very similar, if not the same, in the non-transportation sector. Employers still will choose to do all of the types of testing that they wish to do based on what company policy they've written. And they just may have a different percentage of how many they're going to test when they're doing randoms.
Yeah. Well, okay, I want to go back to the signs and symptoms. Okay.
Sure, absolutely.
I want to know, what are the signs that someone may be under the influence of cannabis when they're on the job?
Sure. So, this one has really become an interesting topic because there's many different things that a person can look for,
Hmm.
but when we look for what we call reasonable suspicion,
Hmm.
we look at physical, behavioral, and performance indicators. So there's three different areas that we train supervisors to look for.
Hmm.
So physically, we may see individuals who will have dilated pupils.
Hmm.
They will have potentially bloodshot eyes. They could have drooping of the eyes. There could be the actual appearance that an individual is very sleepy or tired. But
Hmm.
you could also have the opposite effect
Hmm.
because in the higher potency marijuana, there are studies that are clearly showing that high potency sativa from the plant
Hmm.
really causes individuals to be amped up. So
Oh,
instead of tired, they may be amped up. They will experience hallucinations
mm,
and other types of experiences very similar to PCP. So you'll
wow.
see that happening as well.
Wow. Well, right now, we all know that the federal government is going through the process of reclassifying marijuana. So I'm just curious to know, what are the concerns that this possible rescheduling of marijuana could have on safety sensitive, employers as well as their employees and others that require drug testing for safety?
Sure. Yeah. So, in today's environment, the rescheduling or reclassification that
Hmm.
was announced back in May, um, the actual effects of that really are a few. Okay, uh, first and foremost, it's the first step on a whole list of what drug will they possibly want to reschedule or legalize next. So it's the first step for us. But for the transportation sector, with the language that is currently written, there's no language in there that speaks about a safety carve out and the need to protect safety. So what that simply means is today the Department of Transportation is only allowed to test for Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 illegal drugs.
Hmm.
Reclassifying to Schedule 3 will essentially make it a prescription. And so, therefore, the DOT will not be allowed to drug test for marijuana.
Mm.
And so, what that simply means is that school bus drivers will be allowed to smoke marijuana before they get on the bus and start driving the kids to school, and the employer will not be allowed to test them.
So,
And
Mark, can I ask you a follow-up just to that point right there?
sure,
So with that, so every state is different. So here in Florida, we have medical marijuana, but recreational adult use is illegal. What, and in other states it's the same. So would this be for not, medical marijuana and recreational, depending on what state you live in?
well, we all know that marijuana is still considered federally illegal.
Right, right.
Rescheduling it to a Schedule 3 essentially is going to cause the individual to have a valid prescription.
Okay. For
So,
medical.
exactly,
In Florida,
medical,
for medical. So you have to in
yes,
Florida, you have to have a medical marijuana card and you have to be recommended by a physician. So
right,
by
and
physician. Okay.
correct. And so what that really means is that if an employer, okay, were to drug test for marijuana under Schedule 3, the medical review officer who reviews the results and talks to the donor would then validate the prescription and make the test negative instead of positive. And therefore, employers would have no knowledge that the individual is using that substance.
Okay. And would Florida have to change their laws if they want to? I'm just curious if Florida could do something different to change that. I don't
Well,
like
each
the
state,
politics, but I'm just curious.
yeah, each state has some varying different laws that they've
Mm-hmm.
written in,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's entirely possible that the
Okay.
states may want to go back and reevaluate their current laws and
Mm-hmm.
what changes do they maybe want to make to them, and what requirements do they want to put within that state. So, it could very well be that some of the states will all of a sudden go, well, if there's not going to be a safety carve out on the federal level, we're going to go after it on the state level.
Yeah.
And we're going to do this and we're going to enact that. So that's entirely possible. It
Okay.
could entirely happen.
Yeah.
I think it's a matter that we're all in this wait and see phase.
Yeah. So tell me more about the carve out that they could do at the federal level.
Sure. So, there's a couple of different options. I mean, obviously, on the federal level, they could enact a presidential order, an executive order,
Mm-hmm.
placing a safety carve out, which would then allow for the Department of Transportation to continue to test for marijuana.
Yeah.
And that order could very easily happen. Otherwise, what would have to happen is there would have to be the the presenting of a bill,
Mm-hmm.
so a legislative process, and a bill would have to be proposed, and it would then have to pass through the Senate and the House before it would become law.
Mm-hmm.
So there's kind of a couple of different ways that they could certainly look to do this, and we as resources and advocates for this industry that we work in are definitely wanting to be part of those conversations, so
Yeah.
people are well informed, so that way we can make the best decisions for our actual public.
Okay. Well, we have a question here from Tracy Shell, which aligns with this conversation we're having here. So it says, with this example, don't bus drivers and truck drivers have a CDL and that's a commercial's driver's license, that would also put some additional stipulations on their approval for medical marijuana? Currently active CDLs can't be approved for medical marijuana in Florida.
So currently today, yes, the Department of Transportation does not recognize medical marijuana cards, does not recognize marijuana
Mm-hmm.
on the state level. And there is actually guidance on that. However, once this rescheduling were to go through with no safety carve out language, that would be removed. And it would then allow for anyone, an airline pilot, a truck driver, Amtrak train operator, school bus driver, charter bus driver, they would all be then given pretty much a green ticket to use marijuana, and the employer will not be allowed to test them. Without a safety carve out or some kind of legislation or executive order, we would go backwards.
So, Mark, what could employers decide for their own legal liabilities to say, I'm going to continue to do the drug testing, whether or not there's a carve out, whether there is or not a carve out at the federal?
Absolutely. So, barring whatever happens with the rescheduling, okay, whether you're for it or against it, that's not the topic here.
Yeah.
It really
Right.
doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Okay. But what does matter is that the employer's right to drug test is still in play. Okay. We would hope that there's never going to be a push to cancel drug testing altogether. But I think that employers have this liability and this risk that they want to protect.
Right.
And so an employer could, in fact, rewrite their company policy and their actual standards that they wish to have as an employer. And so they could then, of course, afford themselves the ability to do that. It would just not be on the federal level.
So we have a question here about whether CDL drivers are allowed prescriptions for opiates. And I'd be curious to know where opiates fall on the federal schedule for this question right here as well.
Sure. Great question. Yes, currently today, CDL drivers do and are allowed to receive a prescription for opioids. Okay. And when we talk about opioids, we're talking about codeine and morphine, as well as hydrocodone, hydromorphone, oxycodone, and oxymorphone. So some folks recognize oxycodone being an opioid that is prescribed, but hydromorphone is better referred to as Percocet. So people understand, the generic term Percocet actually falls into that category for hydromorphone and hydrocodone. But when those drivers have those prescriptions, they are of course told that they shouldn't be driving. Okay. And so companies may have a policy that says if you are taking one of these opioid prescriptions that could cause you to not perform safely, you must notify us. Okay. The employer is not saying that we want to know all your prescriptions. Okay. Because now we're invading someone's privacy. Okay. Which the employer does not want to do. But what the employer does want to do is protect safety. And there's an additional process that during the medical review process with the doctor, if the doctor deems that the individual is taking a opioid prescription, they may notify the employer, calling it a negative, so the employer doesn't know about the prescription, but they will put a note with a safety concern, and they will recommend that the employer have the employee evaluated for what is called fitness for duty. And so those things are then in place to, again, protect safety should someone be taking the prescription. It's entirely possible that the employer will never know about the prescription, but there will be a recommendation for a fit for duty evaluation to be done to ensure that that individual will be able to perform their job safely.
Yeah. So, Mark, is there any research out there regarding the testing of cannabis in one's system for these safety sensitive positions when it comes to, how much is in them and how impaired they may be?
So currently today, there is no test for impairment. It doesn't exist. The science is just not there. Okay. Because drugs affect individuals differently for a lot of various reasons. How potent is the cannabis? How much did the person consume? Over what period of time did they consume it? What is the individual's body makeup, their weight, their metabolism, and all of these things take into consideration. But there are some research studies that exist. There's one out by the University of Sydney that actually
is that Australia?
Yes, Sydney, Australia. Yes, they actually did a research study just recently, and they were able to identify cognitive impairment can be seen from cannabis use for 4 to 6 hours. Now, obviously, if individuals are using more and using more often, that cognitive impairment can be seen for even longer periods of time, more than the 4 to 6 hour period. But typically, for your infrequent users, the study actually showed that individuals had cognitive impairment. And when we talk about cognitive impairment, that's having the ability to, do certain functions.
Right.
So obviously driving a vehicle, would definitely fall into that. And so impairment was still seen and was still there. And there's countless other studies and research that's out there around this topic as well. There was a recent survey done out of California where they interviewed 500 individuals about using cannabis in the workplace.
Oh.
And they were able to discover that 53% were using daily at or before going to work.
Wow.
86% of those individuals were either smoking it or vaping it. And 48% of those surveyed stated that they use cannabis on their break at work. So
I'm speechless.
we see these, statistics and see these surveys, and they're concerning for employers and the employer population, because just recently we had the Senior Human Resource Management Conference. The annual conference was held in Chicago, just finished up yesterday. And during one of the presentations, they were interviewing CEOs on leadership and what challenges CEOs face. And the top three, the number one concern that CEOs had was hiring and recruiting qualified talent. The second reason was turnover and recruitment and absenteeism. But the third reason the CEOs have been dealing with and stressing was employee substance use.
Interesting.
So it was very interesting. So there's a lot of data out there that exists, and it's a matter that individuals become informed by looking at that data, so they better understand what we're dealing with when we talk about cannabis.
Well, that's interesting. That's a great segue into my follow-up question on that subject is, what are organizations in the drug testing industry, the associations like the one you're the chair-elect of, what are you all doing to position yourself as a resource to companies as the U.S. goes through this rescheduling process, to help them prepare?
Absolutely. So we are, obviously we're trying to simply be out there, and we're out here to educate and be that resource to individuals who want to be part of the conversation. We also are advocates. We want to advocate. And so we advocate through advocacy and visiting with people in Washington, D.C., educating them, letting them know that we are here. And with our association, we like strategic partnerships and work with other organizations, such as the Smart Approaches to Marijuana Network, the Parent Action Network, the Substance Abuse Program Professionals Administration Association, SAPA is another industry association like the National Drug and Alcohol Screening Association. And we really just want to be out there and make sure that everyone's voice is heard. We want to make sure that we're providing actual good data and good research around this area, so individuals have a full understanding of what this looks like.
Yeah. So is your industry thinking about how you may be impacted by the rescheduling or the reclassification of marijuana? What does that look like?
Absolutely. We truly believe that, it's going to turn our industry upside down, because it's going to change how policies will need to be written. It's going to change how the testing may be done, if at all, sometime. And it really is, as I, stated earlier, it's actually step one in what could be next.
Yeah.
And what drug will be next? Is someone going to try and say that cocaine is good for certain things and it should be made medically okay? And which other drugs? So I think that, we're at the start of something, and we're at a pivotal part in our country, that we need to be out there and we need to be talking about this, and we need to really extend to everyone the concerns that do exist, that individuals may not be hearing about. And that's really what we're trying to do.
Yeah. So do you have any closing thoughts for our listeners and viewers of the program regarding drug testing for marijuana and the potential reclassification to a less uh, dangerous drug?
I would just simply say, do your research, be open to conversation rather than being, in some instances, closed minded. Be open minded, be open to listening and learning and understanding what it is that's before us. Whether you're for something or against something, that is your right. But make sure that you understand what that consequence might look like. And by doing that, go out and research. Be curious, ask questions, demand answers, so you have a better understanding, and make sure that your voice is heard. Get out there and have your voice heard, because each and every one of us matter.
Yeah. Mark, thank you so much for being a guest on this Conversations on Cannabis virtual forum, brought to you by the Medical Marijuana Education and Research Initiative at Florida A&M University. Thank you to everyone watching this program. Tell us what you think about this forum by completing the survey that will be posted in the comment boxes on YouTube and Facebook after this live program. If you complete the survey, your name will be entered into a drawing on July 11th, 2024 to win a $100 gift card provided by one of Mary's partners. We also want to encourage you to go to the Florida Department of Health Office of Medical Marijuana Use website to learn how to obtain a legal medical marijuana card in the state of Florida. We also encourage you to go to the Florida A&M University's Mary website to learn more about this initiative, its educational programs, and additional information about cannabis use in Florida. Thanks, everyone.